What do we expect when we see a story unfolding before us, a story of a woman? We expect the story to be with her, to be inside her mind, and to be narrated from her perspective, not with Mrs. Dalloway. Virginia Woolf, when she writes this beautiful novel, makes sure that we are not only given glimpses of Clarissa's life through Clarissa, but also the other characters who come into her life. In this video, we are going to look at the conversation between Clarissa and Peter Walsh, and then follow Peter in his very weird journey across London. So don't skip any part of this video as we attempt a close reading of the next part of Mrs. Dalloway. In our last video, we left Clarissa sewing, and then she hears the door open. So when Peter Walsh, her teenage crush, walks in, how does she feel about it? So surprised she was to see him, so glad, so shy, so utterly taken aback to have Peter Walsh come to her unexpectedly this morning. She had not read his letter. "And how are you?" said Peter Walsh, positively trembling. So there is an element of discomfort on both ends, and at the same time, some kind of apprehension. They are nervous, and we are also beginning to get very curious as to how the conversation is going to go on. Now, before they begin talking, Peter is seen to take out his pocket knife. And why does he do that? "How heavenly it is to see you again," she exclaimed. He had his knife out. That's so like him, she thought. So this was kind of a habit. He had this pocket knife and used to take it out, fiddle with it. But why does Virginia Woolf introduce this idea of the pocket knife here? You remember what Clarissa was holding? She was holding her needles and her sewing scissors. Now, this is how a kind of a parallelism is created. It is as if Clarissa and Peter, they are set as rivals to each other. Not exactly fighting rivals, but kind of representing two different worldviews. And their weapons are like symbolic resistance against each other. So what are these two worldviews we are talking about? Obviously, Clarissa within her domestic frame and Peter in some kind of international vagabondism, if there's a word like that. And again, the knife is a standard symbol of masculinity, and the way Peter fiddles with it shows that he is in some kind of a constant need to define his identity, and at the same time there's some kind of a discomfort with the traditional way in which masculinity is defined in society. So all these layers come into play when we have the mention of the pocket knife and the way Peter is fiddling with it. And what does Clarissa feel? Clarissa feels that Peter is always judging him. And why would Peter judge him? Because she is within that domestic frame which Peter detests. She knows it. Here she is mending her dress as usual. He thought, here she has been sitting all the time. I've been in India mending her dress. So mending her dress is a constant refrain here, which highlights the narrowness of Clarissa's world, the limits that she has imposed upon herself, and compared to it, when you look at the world Peter has been to, it's like the entire world. India is almost on the other side of the world. So there is a direct assertion of some kind of a condescension, some kind of a pity on the part of Peter looking at Clarissa, and at the same time he is conscious about the difference in their class, because no matter how limited Clarissa's world is, she is still wealthy, and no matter how well traveled he is not up to that mark. So this constant need to assert or to confirm to himself that he is in a better situation and Clarissa has ruined her life. And the way he is thinking about it, mending her dress, playing about, going to parties, running to the house and back and all that, he thought, growing more and more irritated, more and more agitated. For there is nothing in the world so bad for some women as marriage. He thinks that it is because of her marriage to Richard that Clarissa is having this kind of a life where she is only doing insignificant things of no value at all, he thought, and politics, and having a conservative husband like the admirable Richard. So this word admirable is used in a very different way. It's not actually a compliment here. So it is, he thought, shutting his knife. So he is looking at Clarissa as a case of pity. Now, what does Clarissa think about him? Now, of course, thought Clarissa, he is enchanting, perfectly enchanting. Now I remember how impossible it was ever to make up my mind. And why did I make up my mind not to marry him? She wondered. That awful summer, the note of regret. So you can understand that Clarissa is looking at Peter not just as a man, but as a symbol of a freedom which she gave up on the moment she decided not to be with him. And we can understand that the note of regret is a confirmation that yes, she also feels that she hasn't achieved anything in her life, and the domestic fear has not given her any kind of fulfillment which can make this sacrifice that, break up with Peter is a kind of a sacrifice for her. No amount of activity can give her a consolation that it has been worthwhile. And very interestingly, it's Clarissa who begins to talk about the past, about the days in Bhutan, as if she's trying to deliberately bring in some memories, force them into their minds now to relive the emotions of the past. And we know that stream of consciousness is not something that follows any standardized logic. It's not like one memory will definitely trigger some linked memory. The way one word leads to another, the way one thought leads to another, doesn't always follow any pattern or logic. It is a personalized journey. So when she talks about the blinds, Peter ends up remembering her father and, well, he didn't get along well with him. I often wish I had got on better with your father, he said. But he never liked anyone who... And then she pauses. She was about to say anyone who wanted to marry me, but then she doesn't want to mention that word and she changes the ending to our friends, said Clarissa, and could have bitten her tongue for thus reminding Peter that he had wanted to marry her. And then when she talks about the lake, she begins to have these kinds of thoughts that this lake, she remembers that she was a child when she went with her parents, she carried bread in her hand for the ducks. And then when she grew up, then also she remained their child. And instead of bread, she was carrying her life in her hand. And this is written so beautifully. I would read it for you. At the same time, a grown woman coming to her parents who stood by the lake, holding her life in her arms, which, as she neared them, grew larger and larger in her arms until it became a whole life, a complete life, which she put down by them and said, "This is what I have made of it." This. So it's like the life was like an object. It was made and she didn't even realize when it became a whole life. And the sense of despair that she always needed the approval of her parents. As a child, carrying bread for the ducks, as a grown woman carrying her own life in her hands. In both cases, she craved for her parents' approval. This is what I have made of it, this. And what had she made of it? What indeed? Sitting there sewing this morning with Peter. The way Clarissa was behaving made Peter visibly very uncomfortable. And he didn't want to be reminded constantly that life for them was over. He still wanted to be capable of achieving things in life, capable of desire, of relationships. So he doesn't want this air of agedness to encroach upon him. And this is how he reacts to it. Stop. He wanted to cry, for he was not old. His life was not over, not by any means. He was just past 50. Shall I tell her, he thought, or not? So there is something, a secret, which he wants to share with Clarissa. He would like to make a clean breast of it all. She is too cold, he thought, sewing with her scissors. Somehow the secret which he wants to share is related to some kind of warmth, emotion. So he wants Clarissa to be a more open receptacle with more emotions so that he can communicate what he's feeling. And what exactly is he feeling? What secret is he talking about? Daisy would look ordinary beside Clarissa. So there is somebody called Daisy about whom he wants to communicate. And she would think me a failure, which I am in their sense, he thought, in the Dalloway's sense. What is the Dalloway's sense? Dalloways always believe in the achievement of wealth, societal glory, all these things as positive achievements of life. But Peter has a different way to define achievement. So he thinks that I will always be a failure in the eyes of the Dalloways. I can never live up to the standards of the Dalloways. So there is a constant sense of rivalry, competition going on as a battle of sex between the two, symbolized by that pocket knife and scissor parallelism, of course. And when he takes out his pocket knife and is thinking about Clarissa, about the life Clarissa is possibly having, comparing that to the life he has been enjoying with his adventures abroad, looking at that pocket knife in his hand, Clarissa thinks, what an extraordinary habit that was, always playing with the knife, always making one feel too frivolous, empty-minded, a mere silly chatterbox as he used. So Peter, as a person, always gave this air of being an intellectual superior to anybody who was around him. So anyone around him would feel that the person was himself a chatterbox, a silly person, while Peter used to have his pocket knife and fiddle with it. That whole approach was as if he was the intellectual god and others were just incompetent, stupid people. So does that mean that Peter actually made Clarissa feel good about herself? Does that mean that Clarissa would have been happy with Peter if she had said yes? That is the most interesting question, which remains unanswered here, but we can still have our guesses that no, Clarissa would have regretted her life exactly like this, even if she was with Peter, because the problem was not with Richard. The problem was not with Peter even. The problem was right there in Clarissa. Maybe in the course of the novel, we will see if she can realize that, if she can win over it, and if she can turn this regret into something far more positive, far more powerful. Anyway, let's come back to their conversation. But I too. So while she is looking at the knife of Peter, she is also aware of the weapon she has. But I too, she thought, and taking up her needle, summoned like a queen whose guards have fallen asleep and left her unprotected. So it's like she begins to understand that the only way to defend herself is not taking help of any other person, but by her own strength. And that needle becomes the symbol of her inner strength here. Well, and what's happened to you, she said. So before the battle begins, the horses paw the ground, toss their heads, the light shines on their flanks, their necks curve. So it's like a battle is about to begin. She wants to know what has happened to Peter. And before the battle begins, before the real conversation starts, the entire extended metaphor of the horses looking at each other before the battle begins is remarkably put here. So Peter Walsh and Clarissa, sitting side by side on the blue sofa, challenged each other. His power chafed and tossed in him. He assembled from different quarters all sorts of things. Praise, his career at Oxford. So these are like his weapons. See what I've got in life. See what I've done in life. So these are like his points. And then what points will Clarissa give? So what are the points that Peter is accumulating? His career at Oxford, his marriage, which she knew nothing whatever about, how he had loved and altogether done his job. Millions of things. So the way he is using this hyperbolic expression is to crush any kind of feeling in Clarissa that Clarissa has also achieved something. So he said, I've done a million of things. Very proud, very haughty, very self-centered, right? I am in love, he said. Not to her, however, but to someone raised up in the dark India, so that you could not touch her, but must lay your garland down on the grass in the dark. A romantic setup is invoked here. In love, he repeated, now speaking rather dryly to Clarissa Dalloway. In love with a girl in India, he had deposited his garland. So it's like he has taken a step forward to get this girl. Clarissa could make what she would of it. In love, she said, that he at his age should be sucked under in this little bow tie by that monster. Monster is love. So can it still be in love? Like falling in love is something you don't expect Indian people to do. This is what Clarissa thinks. And there is no flesh on his neck, his hands are red, and he is 6 months older than I am. But then she realizes that no, he is in love. He was in love, not with her, with some younger woman, of course. And who is she? A married woman, unfortunately, he said, the wife of a major in the Indian army. So this was quite weird for Clarissa to listen to that, okay, his encounter with this married woman. She is also a married woman. So all these layers are introduced here. She has, he continued very reasonably, 2 small children, a boy and a girl, and I have come over to see my lawyers about the divorce. So Peter is not stuck up with a random young girl. He is about to get into a relationship with a married woman who has children. And then Clarissa is thinking that I am also a married woman with children. So if that woman can get some respite from her bitter life, why can't I? But these things are not stated explicitly. These are the things that come to our mind when we read things like this. And when she's thinking about that woman, she feels that that woman is growing beautiful and more beautiful in her imagination. And especially the intimacy, which she did not enjoy with her husband. She can think about, she can dream about the intimacy that Peter must have with this woman. She flattered him, she fooled him, thought Clarissa, shaping the woman, the wife of the major in the Indian army, with 3 strokes of a knife. What a waste, what a folly. All his life long Peter had been fooled like that. So she feels that this woman is fooling Peter. Actually, she is feeling very, very envious, very, very jealous. And it's like she always had this feeling that although they are not together, she possesses Peter's heart, and now that she sees it's gone, she can't take it. And she's even thinking that all the achievements that Peter has stated about him in front of her, stated and kept in front of her, all those achievements mean nothing. They are only to fool him into thinking that he has achieved something. And what are those achievements? First getting sent down from Oxford, next marrying the girl on the boat going out to India, now the wife of a major in the Indian army. So Peter was once married, that marriage didn't work out. Now he's getting stuck with another woman from India, again the wife of a major. So Clarissa thinks it's going to fail again. Thank heaven she had refused to marry him. Still, he was in love. Her old friend, her dear Peter, he was in love. She can't make up her mind whether she is regretting that she had said no to Peter, or she is relieved that she is not dragged into all these messy affairs that Peter gets into. Or is she trying to console herself that thank God I didn't marry Peter? And while they are on the verge of almost breaking into a fight, something strange happens, and let's see what. I know all that, Peter thought. I know what I am up against, he thought, running his finger along the blade of his knife. Clarissa and Dalloway. See, Clarissa and Dalloway. So he feels that somehow Clarissa is different from the rest of the Dalloways. There is something in her which is separate from the others. So Clarissa is not completely a Dalloway. There is something more in her, something different in her. Clarissa and Dalloway and all the rest of them. But I'll show Clarissa. And then to his utter surprise, suddenly thrown by those uncontrollable forces thrown through the air. So he was feeling so emotional, uncontrollable force of emotion. He burst into tears, wept without the least shame, sitting on the sofa, the tears running down his cheeks. And of course, Clarissa melted. And Clarissa had leant forward, taken his hand, drawn him to her, kissed him, actually had felt his face on hers before she could down the brandishing of silver flashing. So before, the entire war imagery that Woolf plays out for us, just from the point they have met, they started talking. Right when Clarissa is about to brandish her sword and fight, she sees that Peter is breaking down. So obviously they were not about to fight physically. It's emotional fight that we're talking about. But seeing that the opponent has already kind of surrendered to emotions, Clarissa, a very soft-hearted woman after all, although she is often defined as being cold, she is soft-hearted nonetheless. So she's very kind. So she reaches out to Peter to comfort him. And then she's feeling happy about it. And she feels that if I had married this man, I could hold him in my arms and I could feel this happy all through my life. If I had married him, this gaiety would have been mine all day. It was all over for her. The sheet was stretched and the bed narrow. She had gone up into the tower alone and left them blackberrying in the sun. The door had shut. Now she sleeps in the terrace room or something where there is only a single bed. She cannot accommodate another individual in her life anymore. It is lonely. The door is shut. The communication has halted, stopped. Richard, she cried as a sleeper in the night starts and stretches a hand in the dark for help. Lunching with Lady Bruton, it came back to her. So Richard, her husband, had gone for a lunch with Lady Bruton and she realizes that she is all alone. He has left me. I am alone forever, she thought, folding her hands upon her knee. So while she is with Peter Walsh, it's not that she is not thinking about Richard. She knows that she is abandoned, emotionally abandoned, left alone, and she has nothing to do about it. And what was Peter doing? He had got up and crossed to the window and stood with his back to her, flicking a bandana handkerchief from side to side. Peter is always doing something with his hands, fiddling his knife or moving about his handkerchief. There's always an element of agitation, movement, and that gives an air of immaturity even. You keep on constantly fiddling with your arms and that's disturbing almost. It's as if he is yet to reach to that point in life where he can relax, look at life and say that, yes, I have achieved something. There is something very boyish about Peter, something very immature, and I don't know why he is framed as a very intellectually superior being. I find him thoroughly confused and at the same time very, very boyish in the way he is fidgeting with himself. Clarissa, in fact, looks quite mature compared to that. Take me with you, Clarissa thought impulsively, as if he were starting directly upon some great voyage. And then next moment, it was as if the 5 acts of a play that had been very exciting and moving were now over. And she had lived a lifetime in them and had run away, had lived with Peter, and it was now over. So Clarissa understands that Peter is like the 5 acts of a play she has performed in. It is not the real life she had led. It was like a play acting, some kind of dramatization. And in drama, we know that things are always heightened, emotions are heightened, hyperbole is used, exaggerated situations are created. So Peter for Clarissa is not life. Peter for Clarissa is performance on stage. And then it comes to an end when the 5 acts end. Now it was time to move. And as a woman gathers her things together, her cloak, her gloves, her opera glasses, and gets up to go out of the theatre into the street, she rose from the sofa and went to Peter. It's like this episode was like a closure for her, the last act, and now she gathers her things as if she was witnessing herself performing in a drama on stage. So Peter was on the other side of the room. She gets up from the sofa, carrying her things, her cloak and everything. And Peter sees that Clarissa is coming towards him. "Tell me," he said, seizing her by the shoulders. "Are you happy, Clarissa?" does Richard. And then right when we are all so tensed about this emotional moment, right when some real communication is about to begin, there is an interruption. There is an interference. The door opened. "Here is my Elizabeth," said Clarissa, emotionally, histrionically, perhaps. It's like Clarissa wanted to avoid answering that question, is she happy or not? And she welcomes the interruption that her daughter gets into the room and she says, "Here is my Elizabeth." So the kind of possessiveness she shows to her life, to her daughter, as if she has something to show Peter. This is what I've got in my life. And then Elizabeth comes, greets Peter and all. And while Peter heads out, Clarissa reminds him that there's a party and he must come. Her voice against the roar of the open air and overwhelmed by the traffic and the sound of all the clocks striking, her voice crying, "Remember my party tonight," sounded frail and thin and very far away as Peter Walsh shut the door. So this is the point where we feel that we have lost Peter Walsh. Like we will not know about Peter, what happens to him after he leaves, because it's the story of Mrs. Dalloway, right? But right in the next section, we will see that the narrator is allowing us a very jolly ride right inside the head of Peter Walsh, in the mind of Peter Walsh, because right after Peter Walsh shuts the door, the narrative consciousness clings on to him, stays with him, lingers on for a little more, so that we get to see what Peter does when he is not with Clarissa. And this is very important because, and the greatest of playwrights also knew this, that's why they wrote those very, very strong and powerful soliloquies. When a character is alone, by himself, by herself, when they are not conscious of any judgmental looks and people related to them, listening to them, then they behave in their most natural way. So in order to understand what Peter really is like, it is important for us to look at him when he thinks he is all by himself. So what happens after this? "Remember my party," said Peter Walsh as he stepped down the street. So it's like he is satirical about the idea of parties. We know how he thinks about them. So "remember my party" becomes a connector point between the two parts. The narrative flows from Clarissa to Peter almost seamlessly and builds upon the idea of, or rather I would say, redefines stream of consciousness. Usually we feel the stream of consciousness is something which takes place inside the mind of one narrative consciousness or one single consciousness, like one person's thought. But here it flows into other consciousnesses, other minds, and that is something remarkably done in case of Mrs. Dalloway. Why does she give these parties, he thought. Not that he blamed her or this effigy of a man in a tailcoat with a carnation in his buttonhole coming towards him. Only one person in the world could be as he was, in love. Now, the effigy of a man in a tailcoat, this is the typical aristocrat person like Richard. Peter Walsh is probably envious of but cannot admit that. So he is thinking, or he is allowing himself to think, that the man in an aristocratic dress looks like an effigy. It's like those puppets made of straw, which you actually put fire to, okay, in bonfires. So it's a very comic figure that he draws of aristocrat men. And there he was, this fortunate man himself, reflected in the plate glass window of a motor car manufacturer in Victoria Street. So he was looking at his own reflection. All India lay behind him. Plains, mountains, epidemics of cholera, a district twice as big as Ireland. Decisions he had come to alone. He, Peter Walsh. So he is constantly reminding himself of his achievements, as if to allow him some feeling of pride that it's not a waste. His life has not been a waste. Who was now really, for the first time in his life, in love. Now, people in love always think that this is the first time that I'm really falling in love. No matter how many times you have fallen in love, whenever you fall in love, you will feel that this is the first time I'm experiencing it in a real way. The last loves were like, remember what John Donne says in The Good Morrow, that all other beauties were a dream of you. So it's not like Peter Walsh was not in love with anybody before. Obviously, he loved Clarissa. He thought he loved. But now that this is the current love which exists now, so this now is more important than whatever happened in the past. Clarissa had grown hard, he thought, and a trifle sentimental into the bargain. Intellectual people often have problem with sentiment. They feel that sentiments are illogical things and they stop you from being super brainy. And he thinks that Clarissa is sentimental. The way she said, "Here is my Elizabeth," that annoyed him. Why not "Here is Elizabeth" simply? It was insincere, and Elizabeth didn't like it either. So when Clarissa said that "Here is my Elizabeth," that statement means that there's a great bond between the mother and daughter. There's a sense of possession in her. Okay, my Elizabeth. But Elizabeth and Clarissa, they even don't get along well. Okay, there is no intimacy in their relation. So the way she is saying "my Elizabeth," like my daughter, it exudes a sense of intimacy, bond that she has with her. And that is artificial. This is not right. This is not true. And that insincerity is captured well by Peter. He is quite able to understand that. And Elizabeth didn't like it either. There was always something cold in Clarissa, he thought. She had always, even as a girl, a sort of timidity, which in middle age becomes conventionality. People who don't protest anything, they agree to what others say. And in Rape of the Lock, Alexander Pope used a beautiful expression, soft-yielding minds who become nymphs after death. So that kind of a woman who is very docile, is very boring also, and eventually they become very conventional, because conventionality is what? Not questioning what is going on as an age-old practice. So anybody who accepts that from childhood becomes a conventional person, and then it's all up. It's all up, he thought, looking rather drearily into the glassy depths and wondering whether by calling... So he's looking at his own reflection, okay, in a glass, and while looking at himself, he's thinking about these things. Whether by calling at that hour he had annoyed her, overcome with shame suddenly at having been a fool, wept, been emotional. And then he's thinking now that if Clarissa is so cold, she's so artificial even with her daughter, what a fool was I to start weeping in front of her, to show my vulnerability, my weakness in front of her. So he's kind of blaming himself now. Told her everything as usual. So earlier also he felt, when he was young, in love with her, he used to open up to her, and she was not worthy enough to listen to him because she was cold. She didn't understand his warmth, his desire, his emotions. And today also the same thing happened. So Peter is feeling regret now. Why did I tell all those things? And then suddenly the narrative becomes very vague. It tries to move out of his consciousness and give us a general picture of the setting. As a cloud crosses the sun, silence falls on London and falls on the mind. Effort ceases. Time flaps on the mast. It's as if we are about to get on a journey. There's a boat. and there's a mast of the boat where the sails are, and instead of saying sails are flapping, it's saying time is flapping. So like life is that journey, and in that journey we come to some points when we have this abrupt stop and that moment of pause. There we stop, there we stand rigid. The moments when we suddenly have these sense of being caught in some kind of indecision. We don't know which way to go on. The skeleton of habit alone upholds the human frame. Most of the things that we do all through the day are the things we do out of habit. How much of it do we do because we want to do them? Where there is nothing, Peter Walsh said to himself, feeling hollowed out, utterly empty within. Clarissa refused me, he thought. He stood there thinking, Clarissa refused me. And then, how does he feel about himself that Clarissa refused him? So what? What is he? He was not old or set or dried in the least. As for caring what they said of him, the Dalloways, the Whitbreads, and their set. So this entire collection of people who belonged to the aristocracy, like the Dalloways and Whitbreads, he cared not a straw, not a straw. Though it was true, he would have some time or other to see whether Richard couldn't help him to some job. So sometimes he used to take help of Richard for some job and all. But otherwise, he wanted to remain disconnected from this lot. Striding, staring, he glared at the statue of the Duke of Cambridge. He had been sent down from Oxford, true. He had been a socialist, in some sense a failure, true. Still, the future of civilization lies, he thought, in the hands of young men like that. So yes, he couldn't complete his formal education because he was a socialist, so he was thrown out and all. But he still believed that future is in the hands of these kinds of people. Of young men such as he was 30 years ago, with their love of abstract principles, getting books sent out to them all the way from London to a peak in the Himalayas, reading science, reading philosophy. The future lies in the hands of young men like that, he thought. And then when he was thinking about all these things, feeling good that he belongs to the intelligentsia, the intellectual people, the group of the thinkers who are going to actually change the world, he suddenly heard a rustling sound. Patter, like the patter of leaves in a wood, came from behind, and with it a rustling, regular, thudding sound. And it was nothing but boys were marching. And see, right when we have started to forget about the war background, suddenly these parading boys are brought in the scene to remind us of the real backdrop. Boys in uniform carrying guns. So when he's thinking about future of the world in intellect, a scene completely contrary comes in front of him. That future of the world is in intellect or guns. Boys in uniform carrying guns marched with their eyes ahead of them, marched, their arms stiff, and on their faces an expression like the letters of a legend written round the base of a statue praising duty, gratitude, fidelity, love of England. Forget about socialism, forget about intellectual development, patriotism, nationalism. So what is going to be the defining force of the future? So Virginia Woolf's writing will keep on touching upon these political issues as well. It's not just the story of a housewife, trust me. It is, thought Peter Walsh, beginning to keep step with them, a very fine training. So Peter was also trying to walk with them. He felt diverted by this marching, and he was marching along with them. And then the boys disappeared, and he was all by himself. And just because nobody yet knew he was in London except Clarissa, and the earth after the voyage still seemed an island to him. So he was on land now, and he had come to London by ship. And this happens after a voyage that you feel very strange when you're on a fixed land because you're not moving anymore on a ship. The strangeness of standing alone, alive, unknown at 11:30 in Trafalgar Square overcame him. What is it? Where am I? And why, after all, does one do it? Do what? Exist? Undefined. Now, something strange happens. When he is having all these emotional upheavals, about himself, thinking about himself, he sees that there's a woman in front of him. Not imagines it, it actually happens. So stream of consciousness novel is not just about what happens inside the mind, but also like in real world. But she is extraordinarily attractive, he thought, as walking across Trafalgar Square in the direction of the Haymarket came a young woman who, as she passed Gordon's statue, so there was this statue beside which Peter was standing, so this woman came right there. Peter was thought, susceptible as he was, to shed veil after veil until she became the very woman he had always had in mind. Young but stately, merry but discreet, black but enchanting. So he has his own idea of the perfect ideal woman, and this woman's entire get-up fits that, appearance fits that. Straightening himself and stealthily fingering his pocket knife. So he is again agitated, and that is reflected when he is fiddling with his pocket knife again. He started after her to follow this woman, this excitement, which seemed, even with its back turned, to shed on him a light which connected them. The woman was not aware that he was following her. But it's like the moment he started to follow her, a connection was forged between the two, which singled him out as if the random uproar of the traffic had whispered through hollowed hands his name, not Peter, but his private name, which he called himself in his own thought. You, she said, only you. So it's not Peter. Peter is the name the world knows him by, but the real him, that comes out. See, Peter is all alone. Peter is in love with a married woman in India, right? So we expect him to be loyal to that woman. Then why is he kind of stalking this other woman? What is he thinking about? What is he planning to do? And he has that pocket knife. We really begin to feel very uncomfortable here, thinking about the possibilities of such an endeavor, such an experience, or such a scene. But she is not married. She is young, quite young, thought Peter. The red carnation he had seen her wear as she came across Trafalgar Square, burning again in his eyes and making her lips red. But she waited at the curbstone. There was a dignity about her. So that woman is described constantly. He is watching her. She was not worldly like Clarissa, not rich like Clarissa. Was she? He wondered as she moved. Respectable? So it could be that she was not a respectable person, okay? Could be a shady person. Witty? With a lizard's flickering tongue, he thought. For one must invent, must allow oneself a little diversion. So this woman was a little diversion for him. Isn't life all about finding little diversions? This is something that Virginia Woolf wants us to think. A cool waiting wit, a darting wit, not noisy. Not noisy means this adventure which he is allowing himself of going and walking behind this woman, it is not going to disrupt his future life. It's not going to actually cause any big chaos in his life. It's going to distract him. It's like an interlude which he can enjoy but can also forget. So for Peter, commitment, tying up to some kind of responsibility is not very alluring. And this is probably why things didn't work out with Clarissa, for whom we can obviously see that she is conservative, and for her commitment is a significant matter. So this man is going after this woman. She moved, she crossed, he followed her. To embarrass her was the last thing he wished. Still, if she stopped, he would say, "Come and have an ice." He would say, and she would answer perfectly simply, "Oh yes." So there was something very casual, and especially if you think along these lines that Peter is an aged person right now, it's past 50. So that woman might not even consider him as a threat. If he would offer her some treats or ice, she might even agree to it. But other people got between them in the street, obstructing him, blotting her out. This is what life is. Even in the distractions you find yourself, you will find other distractions, other interferences. He pursued, she changed. There was color in her cheeks, mockery in her eyes. He was an adventurer, reckless, he thought. So he thought he is an adventurer. So it could all be just a make-believe. Swift, daring indeed, landed as he was last night from India, a romantic buccaneer, careless of all these damned proprieties. What is proper? Should you go behind a girl like this? He doesn't want to think about that. So his attempt is to break every convention, as if he is extending his fight with Clarissa. Even when Clarissa is not there, he is fighting her conservatism. He is fighting her rootedness in tradition by being something completely non-traditional, chasing a young woman like that. On and on she went across Piccadilly and up Regent Street. Ahead of him, her cloak, her gloves, her shoulders, combining with the fringes and the laces and the feather bows in the windows to make the spirit of finery and whimsy which dwindled out of the shops onto the pavement as the light of lamp goes wavering at night over hedges in the darkness. Oof, that's a long, long line you have here. So the line begins like this. On and on she went. And the line goes on like that. So this is what Woolf does. She actually redefines the way objective correlative even works. She actually makes her language her content. We can understand the way the woman is walking if we simply read the line. So don't think that the language of Mrs. Dalloway is your enemy. The language of Mrs. Dalloway is your greatest friend if you ever want to understand the true meaning of this book. So my tip is always listen to somebody read this out to you, or better, read it yourself. Feel the breathlessness once you begin to read this line. On and on she went across Piccadilly, and you end in the darkness, and that feeling of relief when the sentence ends. You can understand the growing anxiety and the tiredness that is growing up in Peter as he is walking behind the woman, as on and on she went. At the same time, Clarissa's voice is ringing in his mind. So what happens next is, now she slackened, opened her bag, and with one look in his direction, but not at him, one look that bade farewell. So we are not very sure if this woman understood that Peter was following her or not, but she looked at his direction, which can mean that she doesn't want to invite him into her life, but she gives him a kind of recognition that yes, I appreciate, or I have seen you following me. It kind of gives a closure, and closure is always preferable to undecided endings. Summed up the whole situation and dismissed it triumphantly. She was completely, a winner. The way she looked back confidently and got inside her house, it's like creates a sense of confidence. Forever had fitted her key, opened the door and gone. Clarissa's voice saying, remember my party, sang in his ears. The house was one of those flat red houses with hanging flower baskets of vague impropriety. It was over. Well, I've had my fun. So this was fun for him, going after this woman. He practically didn't have much to do that time. I have had it, he thought, looking up at the swinging baskets of pale geraniums, the flower pots and all. It was half made up, as he knew very well. Invented this escapade with the girl. He knows that it was not going to end in any other way. It's not like he was wishing for something to happen. He knew that it was just a game. That walk was a game. Made up, as one makes up the better part of life. That is a bitter thing to say. He says that the majority of our activity is something which we make up, trying to convince ourselves that this is important. What is he talking about? When you want to get a job or you want to get somebody's love, you engage in certain activities and you try to convince yourself that this is what I want for my life. And Peter is giving us a great chunk of philosophical thought here that everything is made up. He thought making oneself up, making her up, creating an exquisite amusement and something more. When we fall in love, we make that person up because every human being is special in some way. But a human being becomes more special in the eyes of the lover, right? Agree? Like if somebody loves you, you will appear to be more special to that person. So that person is making you up. This is what Peter says, that there's nothing special about anybody. It's only the way we make up the person special, our relationship special. Actually, there is nothing special about it. But odd it was, and quite true, all this one could never share. It smashed to atoms these thoughts. Before he could actually share with somebody, he lost track of these thoughts. And then he goes on to Regent's Park, and Regent's Park happens to be a happening thing in our story. A lot of things are happening here. We will see how that becomes important in the later part of the storyline. There was Regent's Park. Yes, as a child, he had walked in Regent's Park. Odd, he thought, how the thought of childhood keeps coming back to him. The result of seeing Clarissa, perhaps. And then he feels that women are always more nostalgic. And he says, for women live much more in the past than we do. He thought they attach themselves to places and their fathers. A woman's always proud of her father. He treats women with some kind of mockery, and yet he thinks that he also falls prey to these kinds of things, like thinking about his past. There's my Elizabeth, that sort of thing. Why not here's Elizabeth simply? He has thought this line before, but is rethinking it. That is not leaving it. He is the one who constantly is getting stuck on this one single line. That why is Clarissa so artificial? Trying to make out, like most mothers, that things are what they are not. She trusts to her charm too much, he thought. She overdoes it. Clarissa is always so overconfident that she is charming, and definitely her daughter has a great bond with her. It's also artificial, and he can't tolerate that kind of thing. I shall try and get a word alone with Elizabeth tonight, he thought. So he actually decides to go to the party and even have a talk with Clarissa's daughter. Then began to wobble into hourglass shapes and taper away. Odd shapes they take, he thought. Suddenly he's thinking about hourglass and those things. Suddenly he closed his eyes, raised his hand with an effort, and threw away the heavy end of his cigar. A great brush swept smooth across his mind. It's like a painting was going on. Intricate things were being painted and painted and painted. And suddenly a brush came and obliterated everything. So it's like he fell asleep. What a beautiful way to say that he fell asleep. Sweeping across it, moving branches, children's voices, shuffle of feet and people passing and humming traffic, rising and falling traffic. Down, down, he sank into the plumes and feathers of sleep. Sank and was muffled over. Muffled over means the voices were getting muffled now. He was getting into sleep. And when he was sleeping, we are looking at that bench. We are withdrawing out of his consciousness because it is all wiped clean now. He's sleeping. Where do we go? We are like hovering on different characters right now until the narrator attaches or latches onto one other consciousness. So we will see how the narrative will first take us through Peter's dream and then latch on to something. What does he dream? Let me take you directly to that part where Peter is dreaming. The grey nurse resumed her knitting as Peter Walsh on the hot seat beside her began snoring. So Peter Walsh is sitting on the bench and there is this nurse who is knitting and Peter begins to snore. In her grey dress, moving her hands defatigably yet quietly, she seemed like the champion of the rights of sleepers. Anyway, so that woman is described as somebody whose presence did not disrupt Peter's sleep. And then when we have the description of Peter's dream, we'll notice that it is done in almost an impressionistic, nebulous language. And there is this constant need in him to be rescued by women. I'll read to you. Such are the visions. The solitary traveler is soon beyond the wood, and there, coming to the door with shaded eyes, possibly to look for his return, with hands raised, with white apron blowing, is an elderly woman. So this traveler comes to this house. There is an elderly woman in an apron who seems, so powerful is this infirmity, to seek over a desert a lost son. So this woman is looking for a lost son, to search for a rider destroyed, to be the figure of the mother whose sons have been killed in the battles of the world. So as the solitary traveler advances down the village street where the women stand knitting and the men dig in the garden, the evening seems ominous, the figures still, as if some august fate known to them, awaited without fear, were about to sweep them into complete annihilation. So within these figures, first of all, don't try to look for any concrete solid meaning of the dreams. We are only getting glimpses of different scenes. What we can gather out of it, that he dreams of female archetypes, the lover, the mother, and sometimes the mother dissolves into the lover figure. But no matter how many women figure he sees in his dreams, nobody can fulfill his idealized vision of salvation. Indoors, among ordinary things, the cupboard, the table, the windowsill with its geraniums, see, everything that he has seen that day. Clarissa's room, then that woman's house with geranium flower pots, everything appears in his dream in a distorted way. Suddenly, the outline of the landlady bending to remove the cloth becomes soft and light. So, his dream becomes a collage, a kaleidoscope of all his felt experiences. There is nothing more tonight, sir, but to whom does the solitary traveler make reply? Because there is no one single woman he can fixate on. They keep on shuffling and shifting because nobody can live up to his complete expectation. Peter Walsh continues to sleep through the next section also. And then he woke up with extreme suddenness, saying to himself, the death of the soul. And then we are taken back to Bolton. Why does he say death of the soul? Let's go back with him. It was at Bolton that summer, early in the 90s, when he was so passionately in love with Clarissa. There were a great many people there laughing and talking, sitting around a table after tea, and the room was bathed in yellow light and full of cigarette smoke. They were talking about a man who had married his housemaid, one of the neighboring squires. He had forgotten his name. So an incident happened and they were talking about it. He had married his housemaid and she had been brought to Bolton to call. An awful visit it had been. And obviously with class-conscious people, this was a very, very serious matter and not approved by them at all. Then somebody said, Sally Seton, that is Clarissa's friend also, did it make any real difference to one's feelings to know that before they are married, she had had a baby? Now, this woman who was married to her master, she was already pregnant. And for Sally Seton, it didn't matter much. She was very, very liberal. So she said, does it matter? He could see Clarissa now turning bright pink, somehow contracting and saying, oh, I shall never be able to speak to her again. Whereupon the whole party sitting around the tea table seemed to wobble. It was very uncomfortable. So Clarissa was conservative and for her it was difficult to accept that a woman can be pregnant, can give birth before she gets married and all. He hadn't blamed her for minding the facts, since in those days a girl brought up as she was knew nothing. But it was her manner that annoyed him. Timid, hard, arrogant, unimaginative, prudish, the death of the soul. So this is something that he means when he says death of the soul. You don't have to be loud and aggressive. You can be timid, have that passive aggressive kind of an approach, and at the same time be extremely arrogant, stubborn, not loud, but stubborn. An impossibility? I don't think so. You will have many such friends in your life who do not raise their voice, but they are so stubborn, you cannot change their mind in any way at all. So that is something Peter hates, because then you can't fight with those kinds of people. They are so timid. You can't fight with them. So unless you fight with them, you extend your logic. They are not ready to participate in any kind of conversational conflict even. And that is death of the soul for Peter. They had always this queer power of communicating without words. She knew directly he criticized her. Then she would do something quite obvious to defend herself. And then he is going on thinking about the way Clarissa was when they were together. It all seemed useless. Going on being in love, going on quarreling, going on making it up, and he wandered off alone among outhouses, stables, looking at the horses. It was an awful evening. He grew more and more gloomy, not about that only, about everything. And he couldn't see her, couldn't explain to her, couldn't have it out. There were always people about. She would go on as if nothing had happened. So we are still in Bhutan, looking at the real problem that had caused the split between Peter and Clarissa. That was the devilish part of her, this coldness, this woodenness, something very profound in her, which he had felt again this morning talking to her. And impenetrability. Clarissa is soft, sweet, civil, but there is some inner core of Clarissa which you cannot reach. Nobody actually understands what she is thinking. Can she herself? We are not sure yet. So this impenetrability stops Peter from actually understanding what's going on in Clarissa's mind, and that frustrated him back then and even now. Like, he started weeping. She never did that. She never said that, oh, I'm so sorry, I'm with Richard, I hate him. No, she doesn't open up. And that irritates him. That irritated him long back too. Yet heaven knows he loved her. She had some queer power of fiddling on one's nerves. Like he fiddles with the knives, she fiddles on the nerves. Turning one's nerves to fiddle strings, yes. For of course, it was that very afternoon that Dalloway had come over and Clarissa called him Wickham. So Mr. Dalloway was quite charming. Wickham is a charming fellow. But it was not the real name of Dalloway, of course, is Richard. But Clarissa got the name wrong. She introduced him to everybody as Wickham. At last he said, my name is Dalloway. That was his first view of Richard. A fair young man, rather awkward. So now we are looking at Richard Dalloway through the eyes of Peter Walsh. Afterwards, he could remember standing by old Miss Parry's chair in the drawing room. Clarissa came up with her perfect manners, like real hostess, wanted to introduce him to someone, spoke as if they had never met before, which enraged him. Yet, even then, he admired her for it. He admired her courage, her social instinct that, okay, you like somebody, fine. He admired her power of carrying things through, the perfect hostess, he said to her, whereupon she winced all over. But when he said that he was a perfect hostess, it's not at all a compliment that he meant. And he wanted her to understand that. And then they went to the lake and it was a happy time for Peter. He enjoyed her company. He had 20 minutes of perfect happiness, her voice, her laugh, her dress, her spirit, her adventurousness. So that was a pretty time, and all the time he knew perfectly well Dalloway was falling in love with her. She was falling in love with Dalloway, but it didn't seem to matter. Nothing mattered. They sat on the ground and talked, he and Clarissa. So they were enjoying as a group. He was feeling that he was enjoying the moment. At the same time, Clarissa was going on towards Richard more and more. And then in a second, it was over. He said to himself as they were getting into the boat, she will marry that man. So marriage is about a social settlement and a compromise, and compromise is something which he didn't want his relationship to have. So he kind of accepted the idea that Clarissa will get married to Richard. I'm not marriage material for her. The final scene, the terrible scene, the breakup, which he believed had mattered more than anything in the whole of his life, happened at 3 o'clock in the afternoon of a very hot day. What had actually happened? Sally at lunch said something about Dalloway, and she imitated in a funny way, my name is Dalloway, because Dalloway was introduced as Wickham and he had corrected saying that my name is Dalloway. So Sally was imitating him. Now Clarissa suddenly stiffened, colored in a way she had, and rapped out sharply, we have had enough of that feeble joke. How many times will you do the same thing again? So this is some joke that was going on happening, and Clarissa was protesting now that she doesn't want anybody to joke about Dalloway or the way he introduced himself anymore. That was all. But for him, it was precisely as if she had said, I'm only amusing myself with you. I have an understanding with Richard Dalloway. So when she said that I don't want you all to joke about or joke regarding Dalloway, Peter understood that she was already thinking seriously about Dalloway and was just having fun with him. With Peter. So he took it. He had not slept for nights. It's got to be finished one way or the other, he said to himself. He sent a note to her by Sally, and in that note it was said that she should meet him by the fountain at 3. Something very important has happened. He scribbled at the end of it. What happens when she comes? There she came, even before the time, and they stood with the fountain between them. The spout, it was broken, dribbling water incessantly. So it was not a continuous set. It was like a symbol of that interruptions in their lives as well. That their life or their love life has lost its continuity of flow. How sights fix themselves upon the mind. For example, the vivid green moss. And all he can remember vividly back from that time, that moment, is how green the moss was. She did not move. Tell me the truth. Tell me the truth. He kept on saying that, are you engaged to Richard? Do you want to marry him? He felt as if his forehead would burst. She seemed contracted, petrified. She did not move. Tell me the truth, he repeated, when suddenly that old man, Redcuff, popped his head in carrying the Times, stared at them, gaped and went away. So again an interruption when the conversation is going on. Neither of them moved. Tell me the truth, he repeated. He felt that he was grinding against something physically hard. She was unyielding. So this is stubbornness. She is not shouting, she is not yelling, she is not fighting, she is resisting in the most silent, coldest way possible. She was like iron, like flint, rigid up the backbone. And when she said, it's no use, this is the end. After he had spoken for hours, it seemed, with the tears running down his cheeks, it was as if she had hit him in the face. Do you hate Dalloway? Clarissa Dalloway. She's cold. But do we actually know everything yet? We are only seeing that scene through the eyes of Peter. So let's not rush into any judgment at this moment. Clarissa, he cried, Clarissa. But she never came back. It was over. He went away that night. He never saw her again. And right when we feel that we are deep in the consciousness of Peter and he's crying, awful, awful, suddenly Regent's Park becomes the site of something else as well. As we drift out of the consciousness of Peter and get right inside the consciousness of some other character. How that shift takes place and how the story goes towards Septimus again. This is going to be the primary focus of our next video, as we will read some more lines of this novel, or rather I should say, as we will continue this marvelous voyage across layers of human consciousness. I hope to see you all in my next video too, and do drop a comment if you are liking this series and if you are still afraid of Virginia Woolf or not. So till my next video, this is Monami Mukherjee signing off. Stay happy, stay subscribed. Bye-bye.